Good morning. I'd like to thank everyone for coming to today's lecture, Innovative Approaches to Clinical Trials. The Medicine Mind the Gap series explores a wide range of issues at the intersection of research, evidence, and clinical practice, especially areas in which conventional wisdom may lead us astray. From the role of advocacy organizations in medical research and policy, to off-label drug use, to the effectiveness of continuing medical education, the seminar series aims to engage the NIH community in thought-provoking discussions to challenge what we think we know and to critically think about our role in today's research environment. Today's lecturer, Dr. Robert Califf, will challenge our thinking around clinical trials. Dr. Califf is the Vice Chancellor for Clinical Research and Director of the Duke Translational Medicine Institute and Professor of Medicine in the Division of Cardiology at the Duke University Medical Center. He is also the Editor-in-Chief of American Heart Journal and is the author or co-author of more than 1,000 peer-reviewed journals. Dr. Califf also serves as a contributing editor for theheart.org, an online information resource for healthcare professionals involved in the diagnosis and management of cardiovascular disease. He currently serves as co-chair of the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, a public-private partnership focused on improving the clinical trial system, and as chair of the Clinical Research Forum, an organization of academic health and science system leaders focused on the improvement of the clinical research enterprise. A member of the National Advisory Council on Aging, he also serves on the Secretary's Advisory Council on Human Research for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Dr. Califf received his undergraduate degree from Duke University and his MD from Duke University Medical School. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Califf.
Thanks. It's great to be here and see so many old friends. It's a little intimidating, though. I was thinking back, I've never been scheduled to give a lecture where the session lasted 2 hours. So my instructions were 1 hour of lecture, but I was also told it was likely that I would be interrupted, and I would welcome you to interrupt. Many of you who I recognize have seen parts of this lecture before. And as usual, I'm going to take a lot of license to provide you with opinions, because I think, for better or worse, people seem to like it when I give opinions, often to tell me that I'm wrong. Because I really hope to convince you, if you're not already convinced, that incremental changes in our clinical trial system will not be sufficient, that we have to really prepare ourselves for a major transformational change in the fundamental way that we do clinical trials. And much of the lecture is really devoted to defining the problem, but I think you'll see that in the context of defining the problem, there's a way out of the box, which is actually technologically a non-problem now. It really turns out to be a social and cultural set of issues that we're going to have to get over if we want to make the next set of advances in health and healthcare. So, let's see. Let's try that one. There we go. Okay, so always need to start with the conflicts of interest. I've had a lot of fun with this in my recent jobs of thinking about conflict of interest. So at the top, I have my usual conflicts that people look for, and we've developed a public website, and we keep it up to date once a quarter. But for this lecture, I also have to note, I actually think my main conflict is not my industry interactions, it's the fact that I do this for a living. So I have a bit of a vested interest in how this turns out. And with this audience, I have grants and contracts with the NIH. So there's a very direct conflict in pissing somebody off or making somebody feel good about what I'm doing. So first of all, there's the word innovation has become such a commonly used word. I remember in junior high school I had an English teacher who would not allow me to use the word vary because everybody used the word vary. The word innovate at the NIH now is, I don't really know, it's used to impress people with something, but I'm not sure what it is. So I went back and looked. Invention is the creation of a new idea. Innovation, according to the way many people think about it, is taking a new concept into either commercial success or widespread use. It's implementing by putting things together. I also, for the purposes of this lecture, I'm going to focus on interventional clinical trials that are randomized, but I think it's important to note something that I learned in my work at the National Library of Medicine, that the official NIH definition of a clinical trial is not necessarily involving randomization, but really is a very broad definition of human studies that I've given here. But the main purpose of my lecture is to try to convince you that, as a friend said day before yesterday in a city meeting, the only difference between clinical practice and a randomized trial should be the toss of a coin. And I really think that's the way we need to change the fundamental way that we're thinking about medicine and clinical practice. So I'm going to talk a lot about the problems. That's the easy part, because if you disagree with me about the problems, I'm prepared with a lot of backup material. I'm going to talk about what I see as the opportunity, and here there could be a lot of disagreement about the feasibility of the opportunity, and then talk a bit about how to take the opportunities and solve the problems. I think it's increasingly important for me when I give a lecture like this to point out that the problems that I'm going to be talking about are a good thing. We have these problems because we've made so many advances that, in my view, we've exhausted the old methods and the old way of thinking. And in order to take the next leap, we're going to have to change the fundamental paradigm for the way things are done. This is a good problem to have. I don't know why, but I was born with a personality to try to identify problems and solve them. So I'm always talking about problems as opposed to good things. And sometimes people get depressed when I give lectures. But you shouldn't be depressed by this lecture, because I think it's the end result of some very positive things. So this is the bottom line. If you go to sleep during the next hour and 55 minutes, from my perspective, really the fundamental problem is that our knowledge has accelerated beyond the ability to provide empirical support for decision making. That is, regardless of what realm of science you're talking about, the fundamental basis of knowledge is moving very rapidly. And when we do clinical trials, we're thinking about a prolonged period of design, often bidding for contracts, a startup phase, and then a very long time to get things done with limited populations of people. And, you know, whether you're talking about systems biology for early phase clinical trials, or you're talking about assessing risk-benefit of therapeutics, or you're talking about clinical effectiveness, the application of what we know in the community, we can't afford to wait for the period of time it's currently taking to do clinical trials, and we can't relegate the questions that we ask to such a small set of questions when there's so many important unanswered questions. And I think there's a fundamental three-compartment model. My thinking about this evolved through a set of meetings at the Institute of Medicine that I had a chance to participate in, but obviously there are many subtypes and everything overlaps to everything else, but fundamentally the way I'm thinking about it now is we have a group of clinical trials that are intended to elucidate biological mechanisms, and I think this part is just as screwed up as the rest of it, maybe even more so. But I'm not going to talk a lot about this other than in one part of the talk to at least tell you what I think should be done, whether it's right or not. Then there are trials to elucidate risk-benefit balance. And, you know, these are typically what we think of as late phase 2, phase 3 trials if you're developing a medical product. But I don't think they're fundamentally any different than behavioral interventions that you might imagine, or technical interventions, which are increasingly going to need to be evaluated as the field of personal information technology continues to evolve. And then the third set would be trials designed to assess effectiveness at the societal and individual levels. And I think types 2 and 3 here actually merge together, if I'm right about what's going to happen, and we're going to increasingly see less of a distinction between risk-benefit balance of individual products and effectiveness in the community. And I think there are basically 3 common methods that need to be done to innovate. The very most important one is improved informatics and better use of quantitative methods. On the way up, I was on a conference call at our own institution, and there was a org chart that was being drawn about one of our institutional entities, and somebody said, "I don't see information technology on here." And then somebody else said, "Well, it's everywhere." And how do you depict everywhere on an org chart? It's a little hard to do. So I think that the fundamental, most important issue we've got to address is getting people over the hurdle of collaborating on informatics. And in the CTSA program, there's been this vibrant discussion about the difference between IT and informatics. I think it is actually a critical thing to acknowledge that they're not the same, but they're obviously closely related. The second part, I could just as easily have said parts 2 and 3 are really just culture. The sharing of data, which is technically a non-problem now, and the linking of investigators and study participants who in the past have been separated and disparate from each other for a variety of cultural reasons, which I'm going to argue are no longer constructive. And finally, and this really came out, we had a meeting of the city steering committee meeting the day before yesterday, which is a public-private partnership, and a lot of different kinds of people are there. And it's really clear, and I'll show some slides that depict this for you, at least the way I've come to think about it. In such a regulated industry where there's so much at stake if an error is made that becomes publicly known, it leads to a situation where people are so afraid to take risks that they never do anything new. And if you believe that we're letting society down by not providing the evidence that's needed to make good decisions, we can't continue to do things the way we currently do them, but we have a set of regulations and people who are adhering to regulations that defeats the ability to innovate. And classically, as I've learned from our business school, if you're going to solve that problem, you've got to create an envelope where people can experiment with agreement ahead of time that it's okay to do the experiment and you're not going to be punished for trying, even if things go bad. But it's really, as many of you know, a lot of my work is conducting large-scale clinical trials that are industry-funded and multinational. And it's always fascinating for me to be in a room with a bunch of FDA people and a bunch of industry people, all of whom pretty much know what needs to be done. They're all really smart and highly motivated for the same things, but the dance between the people doing the trials and the people who are charged with regulating the people doing the trials leads to a situation where the real conversations are almost impossible to have because it opens up risk of being misinterpreted and then having the punishment. So in order for these things to happen, there's some really fundamental issues that are going to have to be addressed culturally that are tough. So in this meeting, we had a list of barriers because essentially what happened in this meeting was that we had reached a general agreement that incremental advances, which we've been working on for 3 years in this partnership, are not enough. Although, I would say that we've made great progress. For example, this whole thing that used to happen to investigators in the U.S., that they would get inundated with adverse event reports. Oncologists up to 300 a month if they were doing clinical trials, mostly from clinical trials in which they were not even participating because of an interpretation of an FDA regulation that a global company would have to send adverse events from Yugoslavia to all of its investigators investigating that product. As simple as that sounds, it took a year to get that taken care of. So there are many other things like that that we're fixing, but it's not going to be enough. And so we had a long list of barriers that have to be overcome, but in my view, they sort of boil down to these three things. Our own health systems in the U.S. are not supporting clinical research. And in our best academic centers, when you go and talk to investigators, for the most part, they feel like their own health systems are working against them when they try to do clinical research. Eve Rosenberg and I are working together on the COAG trial, which is a fairly high-profile study of randomized trial of genetic testing in the use of warfarin. And the tales of woe we've heard from our best academic centers about what it takes to recruit a patient into that trial is just astounding and could be overcome if the health systems had it as part of their mission to help make this happen. I've talked about the current view of the penalty for regulations, and then we all have to acknowledge that despite the efforts of many people, the public trust as measured by polls is continuing to erode. And what's gotten interesting about this is not just public mistrust of pharma. This has now gotten heavily into public mistrust of the FDA. The good news for you is that most people still don't know what the NIH is, but the sort of research branch of the federal government is not held in such disrepute by the public at this point, although we're really worried at academic medical centers now about our own public perceptions, sometimes fostered by disasters like we had in our own medical center a couple of years ago with cancer genomic testing. Now, most of you know about the history of clinical trials, but I feel compelled to just put the slide in just to mention it, that modern clinical trials are not all that old. And there's sort of a slow startup, although it's fascinating that some of the earlier clinical trials were some of the most elegant, I believe, because they were so simple and they answered questions directly. But a very important part of the history of clinical trials that we don't talk about enough, especially with today's politicians, is that there was a time when there was no requirement that a medical product be shown to be effective before it came on the market, or to keep it on the market. And but due to some catastrophes, there was a law that was put into place, and my friend Bob Temple spent a good part of his early career taking products off the market that had no evidence that they were effective. But this led to a situation where, to a large extent, the way we do clinical trials is dictated by views at the FDA, since the vast majority of clinical trials are funded by industry at this point, and often multinational. And so I think one of the problems that has happened is that for a variety of reasons, much of what dictates the general construct of clinical trials happened in meetings that often involve no one but industry and FDA. And while a lot of it was aired publicly at advisory committee meetings and such, since the majority of clinical trials do not provide positive results for the experimental treatment, many of these examples have never seen the light of day because there's no requirement that they did so. Now we have clinicaltrials.gov, which I'll talk a little bit about, which is changing that. But we also have this amazing transformation of globalization where people like me are caught in this schizophrenic state of wanting the U.S. to be the leader, but constantly being reminded that we're only 4% of the world's population. And so why on earth should the U.S. be the leader in clinical trials when people live in other countries? And I think the cultural adaptation to that is a major part of what's happening. And then, of course, now we have the personalized medicine effort, which in my view, obviously holds great potential, but in many ways the hype about personalized medicine has undercut the basis for the need to do clinical trials, and I think incorrectly so, and I believe massively incorrectly so, to the point that it's getting a bit dangerous the way politicians are thinking about the way the system could work. Okay, so now, I'm going to start with what I regard as a success story, and probably just because I was involved in it, but I'm going to give you three examples. And the question that I continue to think about, particularly now that I'm charged with dealing with all areas of research at our own institution and involved in many efforts, is why does this work in some situations and not in others? So we had this problem called heart attack. And it just so happened I finished my fellowship and I wanted to be a CCU director. It was pretty exciting. But the year I started, people would roll in the door. We would give them morphine and some nitroglycerin, maybe. We argued about the nitroglycerin. And we'd put them to bed. And we didn't know what to do other than that. If they had ventricular fibrillation, you would apply some Duke power where we were, and they might come back. And then, miraculously, in that first year, the first coronary angiograms of what actually was happening with a heart attack were produced, and we could see that it was actually a blood clot in there, amazingly enough. You would have thought we would have figured that out before, but it hadn't been figured out. And the mortality rates were extraordinarily high. And so a bunch of treatments developed for a heart attack at that point, and it really pretty much did happen like this. I think maybe because we had a clear target, and then there's some cultural factors that I'll mention. People said, okay, we have a target, it's a blood clot. There's some older drugs that we know dissolve blood clots, and let's try them out in heart attack. NIH was very involved in the early TIMI trials and the early part of this effort. But very quickly, due to pressure from the FDA actually, and due to a group in Oxford, the clinical trials group there, widely publicizing the issue, very quickly we went from small mechanistic trials, which continued as new treatments were developed, into very large trials with large numbers of people that were global in nature. The technological development there, I think most of you in the room, not making a statement about how you look, but you look not that different from me in age. The technological development that made this possible was the fax machine. Before the fax machine, it was almost impossible to do a global clinical trial because just dealing with sheets of paper and sending them from one country to another took forever. But what the folks in Oxford figured out is you could get a clinician to treat a patient randomizing by, and I actually saw this in action, they had actually a bunch of little British ladies. It was kind of humorous in a way, sitting at desks. The faxes would come in and they would assign the randomized treatment using a random process. And then the data could be collected on one or two sheets of paper in a fax machine and sent back to the center. That was revolutionary, and that's what led to the ISIS trials being done with tens of thousands of patients, as they like to say. But once we realized that it took large sample sizes to get the right answers, that was the norm. And very importantly, the FDA essentially said, don't come in here with your little trial. We're not going to listen to you. You better have evidence that you're affecting the key clinical endpoints if you want to get your product approved. And amazingly enough, industry was able to adapt to that, and it did not stop the development of treatments. Now, once we had adequate numbers of patients and we had definitive answers from clinical trials, that part of it makes clinical practice guidelines really easy because you have a definitive answer and you know what should be done. And where you have definitive answers on what should be done, you can abstract the guidelines into performance measures so you can begin to ask the question, if you know what you should do, how often are you actually doing it? And I think a lot of you already know what the story was there. But what's evolved now is a national system of measuring the application of treatment that's taken for granted now by everyone in the field. So much so that the argument now about the main quality measures in this area of cardiology is about whether we should abandon the quality measures because the rates of use are so high that they can't be improved. And some worry that they're being overused because people are so anxious to meet the guidelines. So here you have a system, and in the middle of it is measurement and education about the system. And my question is, why don't we do that in every field? It ought to just be the norm, it seems like. And just to give you some numbers, these are the numbers of people enrolled in clinical trials These are some of the treatments that were shown to be effective. And the research has been done now both in acute coronary syndromes and in chronic heart failure, that if you just add up the number of times you do the right thing divided by the number of opportunities you had to do the right thing, what you find is that for every 10% improvement in doing the right thing, there's about an 11% reduction in the risk that your patient's going to be dead. So that's a pretty definitive thing for society to be concerned about, being dead. And you just have to ask the question, why don't we do this in every field? And my friend Harlan Krumholtz, who tends to be a little tough sometimes on the research that we do, made us really happy when he did his independent study with the Medicare database. And essentially the bottom line is your risk of being dead if you have a heart attack in the U.S. or Canada is 40% lower now than it was when we started. Obviously, a large bit of this is due to the biologic understanding of what causes the problem and the development of effective treatments in a traditional sense, but the development of a system of application and measurement as a standard of clinical care and a cycle of knowledge deriving from that is another key part of it. Now, what would you contrast this with? I had so many examples. Didn't really know where to start, but my favorite one right now is high-dose erythropoietin. And the reason I think to me it's so interesting, it's really to me the equivalent of HRT in terms of turning what seems so obvious on its head. But everybody knows about HRT, so I chose not to talk about that. So here you've got a problem where the epidemiology is extraordinarily clear. If you have chronic kidney disease, you get anemic, and the more anemic you get, the higher risk you are of dying, and most of the deaths are cardiovascular. So this is actually a marketing slide, in my view, and it just makes so much sense. How could you not want to make the anemia go away? Because this would fix the problem. And so erythropoietin was developed, and a number of ESAs were developed. This was a major triumph of biotechnology, and it was so obvious in the dialysis population because the only alternative was transfusion for people who were severely anemic that the proper randomized trials were never done. And so the FDA approved the treatment, and here we had sort of the ultimate example because we have a single-payer system in the dialysis population. And this meant that when you put a quality measure into place, since there was one payer, if that payer said, we're going to pay you more if you meet the quality metric, people got pretty good at meeting the quality metric. And so it was shown that you could hit that target range with persistent bombardment of the patient with higher and higher doses of this drug. And in fact, people did it quite well. And this was wonderful because the doctors made more money, the dialysis centers made more money, the companies that made the drugs made more money. The only people that lost out were the taxpayers and the patients. And we had a fellow who thought that this was not good enough and proposed that a randomized trial needed to be done that would show people that giving higher dose ESAs was a better thing to do. And he sold a pharma company on it, and this is a true story. We were going to coordinate it from our academic medical center, and of course we have a contractual obligation that we have to hold the database and have the right to publish the results. On a conference call with 20 people on the conference call, the company lawyers said, we're going to give this to a for-profit CRO because if it's negative, we don't want it published. That's what they said. So what happened, though, was the trial essentially failed on operational standards through 2 CROs, so they came back to us and said, can you take this trial over? It was called a choir trial. It was a fatally flawed trial in many ways by that time. There was a lot of missing data. But at the very first look that we had of the data, that the data monitoring committee had of the data, they stopped the trial because they said you're hurting people with this higher dose treatment. And this is what the primary endpoint looked like. You'll notice that the low hemoglobin group has a lower event rate than the high hemoglobin group, the opposite of what we expected. And this was across a variety of endpoints. You notice death actually almost hit a p-value of 0.05 in the wrong direction. It's another interesting issue is when you have a negative effect of a treatment, you know, how far do you have to go to prove that it's negative before you stop? Many interesting discussions about that. But the point here was this trial almost didn't get done. It was done to show benefit, and it showed risk. And then finally, a bunch of other trials have gotten done. And the cumulative meta-analysis, you know, is pretty clear that high-dose ESAs are a bad idea. Years after, it was a quality measure, and it had become a standard and adopted extremely well. So in this schema of how trials should be done and how they should be integrated into practice in a systematic way, if you really have a systematic application, you'd better be sure you have adequate evidence before you make it systematic, because you can do a lot of harm in a systematic way if you don't have the right evidence. And then the best success story, and I was talking with Gail Pearson about the cardiovascular version of this, you all know, is pediatric oncology. And it's still a mystery to me why so many other fields have not adopted the model that was developed in pediatric oncology and works so well, and everyone acknowledges it. But basically, you know, to go back to the punchline, my view of pediatric oncology, at least from what I know of it, is that you have a national learning health system where people are expected to participate in clinical trials, and they do it, and the clinical community is geared to look at the results of clinical trials and change practice in a systematic way. And the result has been a very dramatic effect on mortality per 100,000 children. Okay, so what about some more specific problems about the different phases of research? And you know, we're all talking about the valley of death and NCATs now and how it's going to fix it. I think one of the real big problems that we have is that it's unlikely that this scenario is going to change. That is, biology is so complicated that you just are not going to know until you put things into people what the end result is going to be. And we can hedge our bets better through preclinical work, and I think some of the in silico engineering of tissue is going to be fairly revolutionary in that regard. But no matter what we do for the foreseeable future, clinical trials are going to have to be done to determine risk and benefit. And we've got this very long lag time that we all know about that's in play. And given this lag time and the fact that over half the drugs that get on the market are found to have a major problem after they're on the market, it really, I think, forces the issue that what we need to be thinking about is integrating human systems biology into these early phase clinical trials. And the point here is that it's easy to look back retrospectively and say, well, there was an off-target effect that was there. The question is, how do you construct a national system or an international system that has the informatics to take into account and analyze the ability we now have through images and genomic technologies to detect off-target effects. Retrospective engineering of off-target effects obviously can be done. The question is, can we do it prospectively? And this is clearly going to be complicated because, at least as best I can understand it, as we begin to look at the impact of a drug or a behavioral intervention for that matter, or as we're now learning, even when you do something like put a device in a renal artery and denervate it, everything goes haywire in multiple systems at the same time. And being able to measure those things simultaneously, deal with the informatics, and draw reasonable conclusions, not to be definitive, but to hedge your bet about what you might do next, I think is going to be the name of the game. And this has now become my favorite kind of picture to look at. For those of you who haven't been involved in this, a lot of people are enamored with systems pharmacology now and its application to systems biology. What's particularly fascinating to me is we took clinicaltrials.gov data last Tuesday and applied similar analytic techniques to the question of what's the relationship among people who do clinical trials. And it shows a lot of the same social phenomenon that you see between biological systems. There are cooperative groups, and they all glom together, and then there are connectors to the cooperative groups. And some of them are really big and are connected to multiple cooperative groups or multiple trials networks, and others aren't. Well, I think biology's turning out to be the same way, which is telling us that to understand the balance of risk and benefit and to predict it, it's not going to be a linear prediction through one simple proof of mechanism type approach. We were also talking earlier this morning about traditional Chinese medicine. It probably will involve an understanding of multiple inputs into the system simultaneously and the interactions of those inputs. So it seems like an impossible problem, but if you think about it, we now can measure these things in human beings. We're just not doing it, and there's not a place you can go, including the clinical center, where the human cultural sociology of putting all the parts together has been done. But what I think we really need is something that does this in multiple levels. Now, to look ahead to the next part, this is obviously going to create another problem, which is going to require informatics that are equally as complex, and that is we're already in a phase where if you go to see your doctor, the chances that your doctor can assimilate even the rudimentary information that's now available is pretty low. And now we're going to add this complex systems biology and prediction to it through the early phase studies. An interesting and challenging problem. And my argument is that what we're doing right now in human mechanistic studies is like the blind people and the elephant. We're all interested in our part of it, and we look at our part of it in very focused studies, but we're not putting the data together in a way that enables us to look at the whole system, and I think that's going to be important. Now, what about the evidence chasm, to go to the next phase? And I show this over and over for a reason, because it was so illuminating. And the issue here is if you go to your healthcare provider and you've got a health decision, or you're healthy and you want to make a decision about your health, and it relates to cardiovascular disease, I thought 5 years ago that we had done so much good research and clinical trials that we were really informing people well about what choices they needed to make. And so we had a poor Italian fellow, Pierluigi, who showed up, and we said, we got this really easy project for you. It's going to make you popular because you're going to show how good we are in cardiology. So we got together with the ACC and AHA. We looked at all of our guidelines, and we just asked the question, how often when we make a significant recommendation about a choice do we have high-level evidence, that is from multiple randomized trials or a meta-analysis, and how often is it level C, which means we have no earthly idea, but there are experts who think they know, sort of like the high-dose erythropoietin experts thought they knew. And the answer is about 15% of the time we have high-level evidence. Now, with this group, I will admit there's a little bit of a trick here because, as you all know, when you do a good clinical trial, the very next thing that happens is you realize you've just unearthed another 10 questions. So rivaroxaban is effective in treating atrial fibrillation. That's a trial that I just led. But it may not be better than warfarin. It may be as good as, and people even argue about that, and there are two other agents. So now you have a whole set of derivative questions that need to be answered. So it may be a little unfair, but so far no specialty has been willing to stand up and say that they have evidence on more than 15% of their major decisions. ID took a serious look at this and came out at about 13%. That's the current state of the evidence. And we're making decisions every day that are life and death or chronically important, knowing that empirically it's possible to answer the question, but just not doing it because the way we currently do it is so labor intensive and so expensive that we can only answer a very limited number of questions in the universe. if you ask what percentage of the time are we completely flying without instruments, it's about half the time. And I do believe that clinical judgment and expert opinion is better than random. On average, you're going to get a better decision that way, but we have so many examples now where it's been completely backwards that I don't think the level of confidence in expert opinion should be all that high. And then we say, okay, well, what is going on that it's so hard to do this? We have industries that have just, done so well. They've eliminated almost all the jobs related to the industries because it's gotten so efficient. And here we have clinical trials mired in just sort of pathetic rate of getting done. And the problems you're all aware of, and this is just sort of the list that we're seeing, particularly in the U.S. One of the major problems is we figured out how to make protocols so complicated that nobody can do them. And this has been documented now multiple times, and I think the NIH is particularly guilty of this problem right now. And the reasons are cultural. We all know what they are, and I've participated in my share of it. You get a bunch of experts together, and no one wants to be left out. I call it the Christmas tree effect. You start out with a beautiful green tree that should be admired, and then everybody in the family wants to put an ornament on it, and no one will take grandma's ornament off the tree. And you end up with a protocol which is impossible to do and is very distracting from answering the question that you had. And you combine this with reducing compensation because of global competition, particularly in the industry-funded trials, and you've got a real recipe for non-participation in the U.S. And so cycle time metrics in the U.S. are looking lousy, and I know through the CTSAs many of us have been touting that we've solved this problem, but I can assure you when we look at our coordinating center, which does a lot of NIH-funded trials in many areas, it doesn't really look better than it was. And we just finished a major project with industry, and they're not seeing that things are looking better in the U.S. at this point. What has gotten better is IRB times. We've managed to compensate for better IRB times by making it impossible to get contracts done. And so we seem to just be continuing to figure out ways to take forever to get clinical trials done. And in data from Tufts, these are the things that come out over and over again. And so it leads to a situation where, as you know, we often open sites for clinical trials and not a single person gets enrolled, which is a huge waste of time and money. What's gotten interesting at our academic centers is we're now, and most of us are required to actually pay for things like the IRB. And I think that actually be nice if this were done for altruistic reasons, but it's beginning to lead people to say, wait a minute, why are we going to pay $2,000 for a protocol that we're unlikely to ever enter a patient into? And I think it may have an effect. But we're also seeing a lot of disparate among people who do clinical trials and people trying it once and saying, I give up because it's just too hard to do. I lose money for my practice, even in academic centers, and I've heard several tales of woe about this. I have a world-renowned division chief in my division, but your NIH trial is losing money for our division, and we have to meet our bottom line, and I'm being told either don't do it or try to cut back on the effort you put into it, cut corners to meet the cost allocation that you have. Now, as part of our efforts, we've done a lot of cost analysis about clinical trials. And admittedly, this is a focus on the large clinical trials, but I think that there are lessons to be learned here. And it's our belief that, and this is through simulations, taking a lot of people's actual cost data and then applying different ways of doing clinical trials to it. It's our belief that you could pretty markedly reduce the cost of clinical trials if you are willing and able to take the streamlining approaches that we've all talked about now for years but haven't implemented as much as we should. Now, I think you all know that right now, to do a global clinical trial with industry for a major indication in a chronic disease is over $400 million per clinical trial. I've been involved in some that were over $1 billion per clinical trial. There's a lot at stake in getting the answer, and they can take the problems that I've talked about and multiply them by a big factor, because if you deal with 30 agencies around the world, each of which has its own opinion, you have a recipe for the Christmas tree effect now, because you have to do it in order to market your product in other places. But I think the message is pretty clear that we could do things more cheaply if we wanted to. And then the globalization, which I don't think is a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. But it's not a good thing if the main reason is because we have a defective American product, and then we apply American methods to someone else's product, and it leads to equal complications. This is a slide actually that Carl Svedberg made in a debate I had with him, where he took the position that the U.S. should be banned from participation in phase 3 clinical trials, because we have pretty definitive evidence that the treatment effects in cardiovascular disease are less in the U.S. than they are in the rest of the world. And we argued, well, that's because we give better background treatment to everybody, so the treatment effect on the new treatment would be less. They argued it's because none of your participants comply with the treatment. They drop out at higher rates, and you don't do a good job of collecting the data. There's pretty good empirical evidence to show that we are falling behind other societies. J.P. Garnier, who was CEO of GSK, sort of put it vividly from their perspective with a write-up that he gave about what the problems are. And the last bullet there is my own, which is just to remind everybody that another good reason for globalization is that we're only 4% of the world's population, and other countries should be finding out about the relevance of interventions in their own cultures and practice patterns. But if we do look at the real cost data, this is what it looks like right now, and this is from a consortium of companies that do global clinical trials. We're opening a joint venture in India to do clinical trials, and the personnel costs are 1/5 of the costs that we have. Although there's a lot you could talk about with regard to clinical trials in India, there's no questioning that there are many people in India who will provide just as high a quality, and the technology in many of the hospitals now is equal to or better than what we have in the U.S. So these are all things that need to be considered. So one theory we've had is that if you want to improve a whole enterprise, you should look at the whole enterprise. And every industry thinks that way. There's a lot of writing about it, but there was no way to do it for clinical trials relevant to the U.S. until Congress did what it did for clinicaltrials.gov, which is to make it illegal not to register your trial with clinicaltrials.gov or to register the results unless you have a trial which is exempted from the legislation. And so in a project that we've been doing with FDA and NLM, we've been really interrogating clinicaltrials.gov as a database. And it's pretty amazing the number of trials that are being done, 330 a week. Nick, I don't know if is the number going up or staying steady? Right steady. So when I started this project, my belief was we need to put more money into clinical trials, and we needed to do more clinical trials. I'll just have to tell you, and I don't have time to show all the data, you're going to see about 20 papers on this, most of them specialty specific. What I now believe is that we're doing a whole bunch of really trivial clinical trials that aren't answering anything useful, for which people are volunteering. And if we just took the same amount of money and the same effort and put it into the important questions, we could probably go a long way towards closing the evidence gap. Now, actually making that happen may take a while, but I predict it will, because of the sunlight that's going to be shown on this as clinicaltrials.gov gets better and better and easier for people to analyze and use publicly. This is just a look at a paper that I think is going to come out shortly in a major medical journal about the whole sort of overall picture. And this is from a snapshot taken in through September of 2010. You can see a lot of interventional clinical trials in the database already. And it may not surprise most of you, but it was sort of a surprise to me, probably because of what I've done for a living, that the vast majority of the clinical trials have under 500 patients, and more than half have under 100 participants who are enrolled. And obviously, there's a great need for phase 1 and mechanistic studies. It's very important to do, but as you dive deeply into these trials and ask the question, was it really a useful clinical trial? Was there a chance of answering the question really truly with a sample size? And how many of them are small because the plans were to enroll a larger sample, but they never reached it? It's telling you we have a lot of waste in this enterprise if you looked at it as an industry. And this is not just an issue of the phase that you're in. You can see that when you look at clinical trials by phase over time, we're continuing to do a lot of little tiny clinical trials. And I think you all saw the publication issue even for NIH-funded trials. About half of these are not being published within 2 years. And so a lot of work to do here that becomes evident when you look at the whole enterprise. Now then the last part is what about implementation? And here again, I just want to remind you, I can see you look depressed already, but with the problems that I'm going over are because we've reached a point where I think the easy things have been done. And, you know, we're continuing to see this reduction in death and disability. I always feel like I need to show this. It's not that I'm pessimistic. I just think we need to think differently about where we're headed. We do have a problem in the U.S. relative to other countries. And my most vivid picture of this was in Beijing with the Chinese Minister of Health, who said, sort of smiled and said, you know, people from Beijing live on average 4 years longer than people in the United States. I said, can that really be true? I still doubt their statistics a little bit, but there's probably something to it. And right now we're sort of nestled between Cuba and China, at least in terms of global statistics. And we have these huge disparities that are increasingly obvious, and for reasons I'll show you, I think will increasingly be measurable, that we need to deal with. And we're what you would call a bad deal. This is our business school slide. If you were going to purchase health care in any of these countries and your metric was how much do you pay per year of life that you're going to live, the U.S. would be the very last place that you would go. And if we look at quality among the Commonwealth countries, this was their latest report, pink here means bad. I enjoyed giving this lecture in Toronto, a similar lecture about a month ago, and because they like to think they're different than the U.S. and Canada, but I said, you're just as pink as we are, almost. You're next to worst. And they blamed it on us for exporting our bad habits. And our cost trajectory, it's not just the current cost per quality unit, it's a trajectory, which is really scary. We just did an exercise in Durham County, and I'll show you in a minute why we can do this, but if we take the whole Medicare and Medicaid population of Durham County, which is 260,000 people, Medicare, Medicaid is 49,000. You as a taxpayer are currently contributing $430 million to their health care, the 49,000 people. Taking the in-migration, the aging of the population, the Accountable Care Act, which will make 15,000 currently uninsured, now essentially Medicaid-like people, that number 4 years from now will be $760 million. So if that's happening in every other county in the U.S., something is going to have to give in this equation. So what's this new environment that could foster the transformation? First thing that I think people are not realizing enough, although the new Pragmatic Clinical Trials RFA did recognize it from the NIH, is that there is massive consolidation happening of healthcare systems in the U.S. And cardiology, my specialty, got to be the leading edge of this because CMS suddenly decided to cut our reimbursement by 26% about 4 years ago. The result was that we went from 70% private practice or self-employed to 70% greater than 70% employed that is owned by a health system in terms of our practice in just 4 years. And what's happening is that because of the economic issues predominantly, private practice as we know it is going away very quickly. And you can see it in this area really in an interesting way. I hadn't thought about this, but about 4 months ago I was at a meeting with a professor at GW in health policy, and as we were driving around, he told me about what was going on with Hopkins buying the 4 hospitals that are surrounding the big system that's been here. What's the name of it? It's MedStar, yeah. And then you have, down below, you have the Fairfax system, which is also consolidating and building its own medical school. And so when you look at it now, what we have are units of 1.5 to 15 million people. University of Pittsburgh system has now got 15 million customers and 31 hospitals that it owns and runs. And they almost all are affiliated with a medical school. So you would think if your goal was to have a learning health system, and now there's consolidation and integration and there's a medical school that's part of it, that the medical school would be the nidus of a brain center that could serve as a way to coordinate and organize information. So that's a big societal change. And then we have computers. And here I have to admit that I'm at great risk because in 1981, my very first paper, because I had been exposed to a computerized database in the 70s, and it really worked, I predicted that within 5 years, doctors would be interacting with patients with personalized health care and using the computer to predict the best treatment, and they would have a discussion and the right choices would be made. Well, it's been a few years. We're still not there. But what has changed is obvious. You see it in the internet traffic. If you go to rural India, you'll see people like this, and it really is true that cell phones work better in India than they do in most of the U.S. I haven't done much work in the Middle East, but I've now started for a variety of reasons. And in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, the average cell phone per population is 3. I'm not sure what they're doing with 3 cell phones per person, but, and so this part is really happening in every other sector of our society. The transformation from an internet computer-based society to a cell phone-based personal instrument society. And the speed of transmission is changing very quickly, and the connectedness is changing very quickly. And so I'm now being besieged by engineering school professors who say, you know, the cell phone will measure your temperature, it will give your heart rate, you can do your EKG, it can all be sent, you know, in real time to your data center. Why don't you want to do this? And well, the answer is, what would I do with all that information if I had it? But the point is, the technology here is not the limitation. It's our figuring out what to do with it, which I think is a key role for the NIH. The connectivity is clear, and if you ask me to explain what the cloud really is, it's not in my capacity to understand it, but I think we all recognize that one of the biggest problems that we had in connectivity and volume of information is now being solved by big farms of storage instruments, but also the creation of the cloud, which is doing away with the local storage problem in many cases that we used to have. And now we have the intervention platform. So you don't have to go to your doctor to be told to change what you eat. Your cell phone can take a picture of it and send it to the data center, and it can send back a message, don't eat that. And there are companies being formed around doing this already. And you know, all of our instruments and devices are being mechanized to be automatic. I had the real thrill 2 years ago. We were trying to convince Google to get very involved in direct healthcare for a reason I'll show you in a second. And that day they had 7 driverless cars on the highway in California. And they were making the argument that it's actually safer than the number of 90-year-olds that are driving around on the same highways. We'll see. And then the application of this is something that, you know, we've all talked about, and I think, you know, my old friend Eric Topol has become one of the key national spokespeople for this, assuming that we could deal with all this information and we could analyze it. There's nothing stopping us from having the information we need to personalize information. But what I think is going to be more important is that once you have these systems, the ability to look at an entire community changes from the old epidemiologic periodic assay to something that's continuous. And obviously this is technologically entirely within our capability now. So for the personal thing, you know, detecting responders, non-responders, all that, I think we're all familiar with the concepts. I won't go into the details of why I think it's about 1,000 times harder and will require probably 2 orders of magnitude more clinical trial participants, whereas most people promoting this are saying you can do little tiny trials and you'll answer all the questions. I think the answer is actually the opposite, because when you segment populations like this, you end up with an enormous false positive rate, and you end up with every segment needing to have its own clinical trial. And you end up with overlap because of the intersection of the biological pathways that's going to have to be sorted out. So I'm not worried that my livelihood's going to go away because of this. But I think it is going to be amenable not just to cancer, but to multiple chronic diseases as well as acute illnesses. Now, what about dealing with all this data? And this is real data that almost everyone in the U.S. goes to the internet for health information, and now more increasingly to their cell phones. I won't say what the first 2 activities are. One of them is not good, but there are other activities that are done on the internet. But think about doctors. 81% of doctors use a straight Google search now when they're in the clinic to look at medical information. It's exactly the same information that patients are looking at. And average time spent is less than 3 minutes, and 90% of them don't go beyond the 3rd hierarchical search. So this is telling you that the human interaction with the computer is not at the point where this complexity can be assimilated, and it's something that we're going to have to understand how to deal with. And the bad news for people who like to be excited about finding a cure for a disease is that the hard work here is really informatics. It really is informatics, and then it's the study of the interaction of the human brain with these automated systems and how they ought to work. I would argue neither one of which is getting the investment that it currently needs to get us to the place that we need to be. Now, the punchline for me, and where I think I'm going to say in 10 years, I really believe we're going to be here because I think the tipping point has already been reached, is that all of this information can be embedded into geospatial architecture. And why would that be important? Well, I think the reason it's important is that I think many of you in the room already know that the biggest determinant of health is your social context, not your biology, unless you're unfortunate enough to be born with one of the few rare diseases that affects people in a major way at a young age. And so if you really want to understand how to intervene to make a difference, you're going to have to not only understand the information about the individual and their biology, you're going to have to understand the impact of where they live and who they interact with and why they do that. So as many things tend to happen, I was just at a meeting on campus one day, and Marilyn Miranda, who was in the School of the Environment, was showing some information. She was concerned about lead poisoning in our county. And she had figured out that by sending students around and taking all the publicly available information, she could look at every household in Durham County and figure out the risks that the pipes had lead, and also figure out the probability that the people living in the house would do something about it on their own. And so this led to a risk profile, and also figure out where the children were being born, because it's children you're most concerned about. So this led to a public health system where quintiles of risk were developed, and people in the worst quintile, the highest risk of having lead and not doing anything about it, got a household visit. People in the best quintile, mostly Duke professors who were going to take care of their own homes, did not get a visit, but just got a letter in the mail, and then there were things in between, and it really worked spectacularly well. And so I asked the question, have you ever thought about putting electronic health data into that information? And we have a secret weapon in Durham County, which is that for unusual reasons, we have a monopoly on healthcare delivery in Durham County. It's a place called UNC, which today is not a popular topic with me, which is 8 miles away. My next stop from here is the ACC tournament in Atlanta, to 4 days of basketball. But you know, they have a monopoly in Orange County next door, and there's overlap, but not as much as you would think. And interestingly, due to a CTSA project, we're actually timidly sharing some real health data between the two systems that are competing. So in order to do this, we had to engage in about 3 years of very intensive chicken dinners in churches and schools and all kinds of places to build public trust, because this started very shortly after the lacrosse case, which had a lot of implications that many of you know about. But the end result is everybody signed on. The public health department, the federally qualified health center, the congregational leaders, so on and so forth. And we've done it now, so that like other geospatially inclined people, and there, as you know, there's a lot of this going on in multiple diseases now, we can look at Durham County and see pretty much everything that's going on almost in real time. So this would be the typical thing you would look at, which is geographical neighborhoods. This just shows you people, household median income, and percent African American. But what we can do now is look at individuals by the household, exactly where they live. Now, these data are jittered, which means you could not actually identify an individual. It's been randomly moved so that the individuals are moved around. And we're now over 90% of the population in this system. So, for example, if you want to know about diabetes, we know we have exactly 14,345 people who at least have been diagnosed with diabetes who live in our county, and we know exactly where they live. And we know everything about their health data, but we also know about their neighborhoods and their environmental data. So now let's go back to the beginning, and let's say that we had a question about diabetes. Why on earth, if you had a system like this, should it take you 4 years to enroll into a trial of diabetes? You wouldn't need that much of the American population in a system like this to go directly to people on their cell phones, get them to agree to be involved, and maybe you should collect the data, or most of it, on the cell phone, and the parts that you already had in the electronic record, why would you need to recreate that in an expensive parallel universe of clinical trials? Now, I'm not proposing this can be done next year, because a lot of the issues that we were able to overcome because of our little Europe, as I call it, in North Carolina, if you have competing health systems, this is really hard, because even sharing data becomes a matter of competitive intelligence, and all kinds of issues come up. And then finally, because of the way the technology is proliferating, this is not something that's U.S. specific. So even for rare diseases, if you thought about your rare disease that you're struggling to enroll a cohort in the U.S., much like the business people are telling me with marketing now, we used to think of a market as 800 million people who lived in U.S., Western Europe, and then selected people in the rest of the world. Business people are now thinking of the market as 6.5 billion people. I think, given the connectivity that we now have, and if you haven't seen it, one of the most amazing things is to talk to the R&D people at AT&T or Verizon. They'll show you the 11 billion calls a day that they now track using the same kind of social networking analysis that you see for biology or for clinical trials. So, how could all this come together? Well, we have these different dimensions that we need. I do think the high-intensity mechanistic human biology studies need to be cordoned off, and I think that's a separate issue. Finding volunteers that would be the right people to study the right thing could use this larger system. But I think everything else could easily fit into a system that was driven by coordinated, integrated health systems with electronic records that shared data. So we need an early phase trials network. This is more of a message for NCATS as far as I'm concerned. I hope that this happens and we get over the institutional problems that keep us from coordinating. I'm going to zip through this quickly to get to the end here. But you can, I think you all know the kinds of things that could unravel this. And I don't think a single center can do it. I think it needs to be a network of centers that do it. We are creating our own mini version, which has been exciting and fun, that includes North Carolina and Singapore, where we have a medical school now, which has its own interests, and Delhi, where, as I say, we can do exactly the same study with better technology for about a fifth the cost. And you begin to think about the impact that has on the kinds of studies you could do. It's pretty dramatic. And then what about the evidence chasm? My main point here when I talk to politicians is please don't forget the basics. You'll notice when I've talked about innovation, I haven't said there's a fancy statistical method that I think is going to solve the problem. I think the fundamentals of therapeutics are well known, and they're not going to change. The innovation, I think, needs to be about the playing field that we're playing on, not the rules of the game once we're on the playing field. Use this to remind people that what seems obvious, sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not. These are, I think, fundamental principles. Most of what we do has a small effect, and I'm just going to stop at that one, but there are others. They're not going to go away, no matter how much genetic targeting that you do, and the only way to really know is going to be to evaluate your intervention in real human beings in a real living system. Now, one fun thing for me in preparing this lecture was to go back to the roadmap almost 10 years ago. It's a little scary. And you all remember these diagrams, those of you who were involved. But if you look at it, notice the 4 to 7 year time frame, data standards shared across institutes, funding mechanisms based on efficiency, a safe haven to do experimental things, and then over on the right-hand side, 8 to 10 years, a common medical nomenclature, data standards updated in real time, national repository of images and samples. I think, and then at the very hardest, at the upper right-hand corner, the goal would be a national system in which patients and families and investigators are linked together through a common information system. And my argument today is that we actually have made amazing progress in all the technological parts of this. And we've made significant progress in the cultural parts, but that is the element that's holding us back at this point. And I'm sure there are good reasons for that. And many of you remember Steve Strauss. These are his slides. I've held on to them, and I think he really could passionately talk about this. And it's beginning to happen now, although it's still culturally difficult. You know, the old model of the NIH network with a single coordinating center and sites that function in a node, to thinking about interoperable data with multiple coordinating centers, or the preferred system would be a network where the nodes all had access to the data at the right times to analyze. And there's been a lot of progress here, but I think you'd probably all agree we're just not quite there yet in terms of what could be done. One place where I think amazing progress has been made, and it's going to be really interesting to watch, and it is, I have to disclose it's a project we've been very involved in, is the Sentinel project. And as things often happen in the U.S., the Congress said, you are required as the FDA to assemble 100 million electronic health records. And so that's what they've tried to do, and the current number is 127 million electronic health records in a system which is able to retrieve data. You can read about it in the New England Journal, but I think one of the most important things that's been done with this is to solve the problem that people don't want to contribute their data if they completely lose control of it. So what's been done is to take data partners, allow them to maintain their own data, agree to a set of standards for exchange, and then through a set of protocols, put the information together when there's a good reason to do it. The socialist part of me would say it'd be better just to have one system and do it all right, but in America that's not going to happen, and they've been trying to do it in the UK for decades, and they've made some progress, but they've recently declared failure of their latest electronic health record effort as a unified single effort. So I actually think this is probably the best solution for our culture. And the step between this and doing clinical trials is only limited now, in my opinion, by two things. One is improvement in the informatics of agreeing to common terms and definitions. And two is culturally getting health systems to agree to participate so the doctors and nurses have time to talk to the patients about being randomized. That sounds like it ought to be achievable, but as we've been working pretty hard on this the last few months in concept, that is the problem. The thing that works well on Sentinel now is that it's totally passive. That is, the providers don't even know it's happening. The data is submitted as electronic data from the data providers, who are the insurers or the health systems, depending on the case. But now if we're going to do interventional studies, we've got to add this very tough cultural element. And so a system that looked like this, I think, would be far superior to what we have now. Multiple integrated systems with electronic health records, common data terms, and embedded in that, disease registries, which as many of you know are taking off in a major way, partly driven by the fact that as practitioners we need those disease registries to demonstrate the quality of what we're doing in order to get paid. And so at the bedside, it would look something like this. And this truly, if it happened, would be a system where clinical care and randomized trials would only differ by the fact that a coin is being flipped to determine the treatment. I'm going to skip through adaptive designs other than to say, these are slides from Pharma, but I just thought they were really good. Other than to say, I don't think adaptive designs are going to solve this problem. I think it's an important change in thinking that will help incrementally in a very significant way. But let me get through this so I can get to the end. I think for all kinds of interventions, whether they're at the community level or the individual level, understanding the dose-response relationship is going to be a critical issue. And by using adaptive designs and systems set up to be adaptive, I think there are ways to get answers incrementally more quickly and probably more reliable answers about finding that dose-response relationship that turns out to be critical. And I like this slide in particular because it makes the point I like to make about it. An adaptive plan is not an adaptive plane. The point here is that adaptation is something that you build in by design with a plan. It's not a mechanism to correct for lack of planning or understanding. I think that's frequently confused. So then the last part, we're all stuck with this generalizability issue, and we all know that right now it's fair, for the most part, to levy a criticism of clinical trials, that clinical trials enroll a small segment of the population, and extrapolating to the whole population can be risky and dangerous. And I think the way to deal with that is to evolve as quickly as we can to the kind of system that I described, and we've gotten a glimpse of it through the national registries in heart disease, where pretty much now, for most areas of heart disease that are in the mainstream of coronary disease in particular and heart failure, there are national registries that people need to use in order to document their quality. And so if we know that, and we begin to collect that data in a systematic way, and we add in the elements that we want for a particular study, this would be a way to pretty dramatically reduce the cost of doing the clinical trials. And one element that I think needs to be used much more often in this way is cluster randomization. And this is just one real example of what we did with the Society for Thoracic Surgeons a while back, where there were two pretty simple questions. Could you get beta blockers used, and could you get the internal thoracic artery used as opposed to veins in practice? So there was a randomization to an educational program. It was done by practice. Basically, it worked. But the beauty of this system if it's a continuous system, is that when you finish the trial, you can immediately see what's happening after the trial is done. You don't need a follow-on study because you're already collecting the data that's telling you what the uptake is in practice when the study is over. Okay, so you may not believe any of this can be done. Maybe I'm crazy. I don't know. I think it actually can be done. I think we're over the tipping point. So what's holding it back? And here I think it's worth thinking about what holds back innovation in general as people who study innovation are looking at it. So if you talk to Clay Christensen, who's sort of the person that gets a lot of the credit for writing about innovation from a business school perspective, usually what you have is something that performs at a certain level in a technology, and there's progress in that technology. Things get better. And I would say the clinical trials enterprise, on average, has gotten better. We're doing a better job than we were 10 years ago, incrementally better. But in most areas of society, something comes along that starts out being worse. It's clunky, mistakes are made. And of course, the example we all use is the solid-state radio compared to the transistor radio. Many of you remember the cheap Japanese transistor radios that we used to make fun of when I was a kid. And of course, what happened was there was no way that you could make solid-state better than a transistor once it reached a certain point. But that was an unregulated, market-driven component. So as a rule, when people have looked at disruptive innovations that have really changed the way things have done, it's replaced the old thing, not evolved from the old thing. It's a little rough on people who are happy doing what they're doing. And so when you think about this, then in a lightly regulated market, it makes sense that you could be under the radar screen, you might have a cheaper or less good product, and eventually you'd get better and you would win out. You have to get above a threshold, but in a highly regulated market, that threshold is so much higher that you'd have to be a fool to be the disruptive person, because the likelihood that you could get your product to the point where it would replace the old one in the eyes of the people doing the purchasing would be quite low. And I think that is a fundamental problem that we're now facing. I think eventually this will happen, but my argument is there's a lot at stake for us in creating an environment in selected places where the mistakes can be made and it will be okay because it's done in an environment that's planned to be that way. And the fundamental issue then is, I think our clinical trials enterprise, if I had to describe what clinicaltrials.gov has taught me so far in the work that we've done, is that when you really drill down on it, it looks a lot like this. And I prefer that it look like this. And what's in between these two things is mostly informatics and culture. So in conclusion then, we're left with these same barriers. I think they're really important, and I hope that many people will join together in overcoming these barriers, because a lot of people, I think, are seeing the possibility that's there. And ultimately, in a way that I couldn't have imagined, it's obviously technically possible that whether you're a clinician in a rural village in China, or you're at Georgetown Medical Center or Duke University, on your personal device is going to be a mechanism to get the information that you need, but also generate knowledge through contributing to that information base in a very facile way, and that our patients and families will be linked to the same system. Because guess what? They already are. We're all just using Google right now to find out and make decisions about what we do. So just for fun, the last couple of slides. I think I actually do worry about this. We've been the envy of everyone else. Increasingly in my global work, I'm finding that people still admire Americans, but we're not the envy that we used to be. And maybe we shouldn't be. But I would like that to be the case, because we're global partners who are the chief innovators. So I think the plea to do that is really critical, and I think in clinical trials is critical. So since I'm headed to Atlanta Also emphasize that the ultimate winning team is going to be the one with the best teamwork, not the one that cordons off its activities and tries to keep it separate. So thanks for listening to this. This is at least my view of the world, and I look forward to questions and comments that you have.
This is being webcast, so I ask that if you have questions to please use the two microphones on the in the aisles.
Probably the best example that I can think of a disruptive innovation in medical care has been the development of laparoscopic surgery. Can you discuss what made that special so that it was so rapidly implemented and accepted?
I think laparoscopic surgery brings up a tough problem that we all should worry about, and I sure don't know the answer to this problem. But I think the main driver is that people obviously want non-invasive surgery. They desire it. And so there's a huge driver from the customer perspective for that to happen. But against that, you have regulations that make it really hard to develop, for example, a new device, and increasingly hard in the United States. And personally, I'm stuck in between because I have personally seen the ravages that can happen when you let a device inventor loose without regulation and proper attention to experimental rules. But on the other hand, if we look at our own surgery department, we have a huge, in our integrated health system, a huge surgery group. And surgeons are rewarded for getting to the operating room on time, adhering to the regulations, and getting out of the operating room at the lowest cost with patients who are satisfied. So if a surgeon says, I got a new idea, let's try this laparoscopic device, first thing that's going to happen is the administrator in the OR says, wait a minute, you're going to slow down the schedule. And now, in the old days when laparoscopic devices were first developed, it really was, people didn't pay a lot of attention to this stuff. People fooled around with their devices and things evolved because of that. So I actually think that in the old days, that barrier that I showed on the business school slide was pretty low, relatively speaking. It's gotten so high now. For example, in my arena, percutaneous cardiac valves, huge deal. The U.S. is, I think it's 54th in the world to get access to percutaneous cardiac valves because we're so regulated. You could argue maybe we don't want to be first, but somewhere in between. So I think there's reason to worry about our ability to innovate in such a regulated environment. I think it happened with laparoscopic surgery because the barriers were lower at the time and the demand was high. I would also never underestimate the inventiveness of the American people in getting what they want. So I'm expecting that part of the cell phone thing that's going to happen is people are going to start going directly to the public to make things happen as opposed to the traditional route.
Thank you very much. It was very inspiring and provocative as usual. I wanted to ask you, what are the thoughts around running large clinical trials in India and China? As you explained, there will be a lot of incentives in terms of cost and probably patient adherence to the treatments and so forth. Yet I think we could all expect in the same time the effect of the environment, the genetic makeup and other things to influence the results. And how would the results be transferable to treating people in the US or Eastern European countries or things like that? Maybe the nexus between personalized medicine and large clinical trials. And what are your thoughts?
I think this is one of my favorite topics because it is also such a mind-bending issue. And so it's fascinating to me. There's a report about to come out called PCAS, President's Committee to Advise on Science and Technology, and it's focused on concern that the administration had that pharma and biotech jobs are leaving the U.S. at the rate of about 10,000 a month right now, mostly because of offshoring of activities. Or as a friend from Pfizer told me this morning when I was on the phone with him, all the money's in China, so we're going to put our place there because they're going to pay for the stuff with Chinese money. But it's amazing to me how many people who don't really understand medicine and clinical trials think that clinical trials are like a laboratory experiment where, you know, as a friend of mine said, the great thing about transgenic mice is they show up for the experiment every day ready to go. Whereas human beings live in this cultural environment that I showed you, and the data that we're seeing is it's just profound about the impact of where you live on what's going to happen to you. And just to give, you know, what I think is not talked about enough is this OMT trial. OMT, I think that's right. It's a trial in Chicago where HUD actually did a randomized trial of randomizing people to get vouchers to move out of their neighborhoods or not. And the result they just published in the New England Journal on Diabetes and Obesity was essentially equivalent to the DPP trial. And the other interesting thing about the trial is you got a voucher where you could move anywhere you wanted. You did better with regard to obesity and diabetes than if your voucher gave you the ability to move to publicly subsidized housing only in a different neighborhood. So now you say, what about, if you believe that clinical trials are just a laboratory experiment, one attitude that I hear frequently, even among pharma execs, is why not just do them in China? It's a lot cheaper and you get 10,000 subjects and get your data and you get an answer as to whether the treatment worked. And of course, what I would say is you don't know whether that result is going to be extrapolatable to the U.S. population for a whole variety of reasons, some of which are genetic, but a lot of others have to do with diet and the medical care system that we work in. But if I was putting on the hat to argue against myself, I'd say if you believe that, then even trials that you do in the U.S., given the heterogeneity that we see by neighborhood, you'd better start thinking about small area variation as well as large area. But, you know, the good news here from my view is that the FDA has pretty much decided policy-wise that if you're going to market your product in the U.S., you've got to have some proportion of your population studied in the U.S. unless you have a very strong reason to argue that it's not necessary. Now, so if that's what we think in the U.S., what does that say about Chile or South Africa or Poland? Should they have a representative sample from their countries? And of course, since we're building a university in China that's going to open in 10 months, what I'm hearing from the Chinese is, we're sick and tired of your doing trials in U.S. and Western Europe and then telling us what the right dose of a drug is. We've got the money, so we're going to do our trials in China and we're going to tell you what the right dose of a drug is. See what you think about that. So this is, what's that?
It may be applicable for Chinatown.
Could be applicable to Chinatown. It's possible. So this is one of the many reasons why I think we need 2 orders of magnitude more research participants, and it's not possible to do that the way we currently do clinical trials, so we better be thinking about this other way of doing things at a much lower cost. Yes?
Thanks very much for your comments. I'm Rick Berzon with the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities, also a Duke graduate, having gone through the Terry Sanford School before it became the Terry Sanford School. And just have a couple of questions for you. One is, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the patient-centered movement and patient-centered outcomes research effort, and how you think that may play into some of the challenges within the current clinical trial system. In other words, perhaps through community-based participatory research and working closer with the community and their involvement in the process of the design of clinical trials. Of course, that would push the timelines out, but you might get better adherence or at least buy-in from the community in which you're trying to do these trials. I mean, I've worked in industry myself, so I understand the issues around costs and timelines. But we've often, as I think you pointed out, neglected the involvement of patients in designs and in the entire process. And so is the current migration to try to improve that issue going to help or hurt the process? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. The other question I had is just the whole issue of risk and trust in general. I mean, it's particularly the case in disparate population groups that have suffered historically from some of these problems, so it's understandable that there would be risk issues there. But, I mean, the whole issue of the charge of the FDA in protecting the public from risk, well, what's the threshold? And that's a political issue, and how do you address that in the long run?
Well, those are two great questions, and sort of like all the questions so far, it's impossible to have a clear, easy answer. But basically, my feeling about patient-reported outcomes and patient-centered research is that it's going to be the answer I think for the reasons that I sort of went through in the talk. As we get into this information-intensive world where people are connected the way they are, you know, there's always with technology, there's an adoption phase you have to get through, but ultimately I believe people do gravitate to authoritative sources as much as they can. And so I think feedback, both collecting data from patients or members of the public in the case of staying healthy kinds of clinical trials, both in the design phase and while the trials are ongoing, is going to be critical. And we had an example that came up in City. One of our two patient advocates in the consortium is a woman who entered a patent for Raymond O'Valley clinical trial, so a PFO trial, which is with a device to close it to prevent stroke. And it was a questionable indication, but a good trial to do. And the point she made to us is that what happened in the trial is the device company did some very bad things that they should not have done. But the main reason they got caught is that the patients were communicating with each other on the internet. They formed an internet group, and they were comparing each other's experiences to what was being reported from the trial, and it didn't match up, which was an interesting way of policing bad device companies. But you know, so I think the wisdom of involving people after the short-term pain of figuring out how to do it and how to deal with the chaos is going to be important. I would also point out, as you well know, that there are whole disease areas where the patients and their families have taken over, and who are in the cystic fibrosis arena. You just can't do a trial without the assent of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation and its participants, and you can't even really see cystic fibrosis patients in large scale without submitting your quality data to the foundation for independent evaluation. So I think this is the way things are going to go. I'm all in favor of it. In terms of trust, I mean, I've had many lessons in our project about it. And what I would say is that at least in my experience so far, if people believe that you're sincere and you're giving an honest effort, they'll give you the benefit of the doubt. And having spent time in Durham, you'll understand this. I think other people, without knowing the details, could probably understand it too. Durham has a long history of racial strife and also a town gown issue, which all plays together into interesting politics and such. There's a group called the Committee on the Affairs of Black People, which has only black members, which is a very powerful political structure in Durham County. And one of my concerns was that when we went to them and said, we want to put your health record data into a system where we can see exactly where you live and use it for research and to improve your health, that this would cause a tremendous problem. Livonia Allison, who headed the group at the time, who's fairly notorious for publicly accosting people, stood up and said, "It's about time you told us the truth." She said, "As long as we get to see the data too, this is the best thing that could have happened to us because you put us into these neighborhoods. There are no grocery stores where we live. There are no safe places to walk, and now we can see it. And we all have to look at it together, and there's a higher chance that something's going to be done about it if we all have to look at it." But I also understand that all it takes is a few slip-ups in that building of trust, and you can lose it. So I think these things are integrally tied together, and a lot of it, to me, is convincing people that if their data are used, that they're going to be perceptibly better off. And that ties back to patient-centered research because, as you pointed out, unless they're involved in it, they're not going to be able to see it. So I know, this a little bit pie in the sky, but I think it's possible to work this out. I think we're doing it.
Thank you.
Hi, Rob. My background is in pediatric oncology, so the one slide that you showed, which had the learning health system, is something that I lived in for a very long time. And I think it's been a real education for me coming out to the rest of the world where there's a radically different culture. And it seems to me that particularly as we need more and more people participating in research, both from the standpoint of actually getting their data collected, but also health caregivers and everybody else. One of the key issues really is changing the culture so that we do have the sense that you're just describing in terms of the interactions in Durham. And it seems to me that we need to really make a real attack to create that kind of thing so that people have the sense that we're all experimental subjects whether we like it or not, and the only issue is whether anybody's actually doing anything with the data that's good. Have you thought about how we can move that along? Because in addition to the fact that we actually made major strides in terms of the care of patients, there was no gap between gathering the data on improved therapies and actually implementing it. And it seems to me that we ought to be able to use that example going further. Of course, you're talking about, rare disease, small number of people, but can we scale that up?
Susan, what you're describing is one of the biggest cultural problems, and you and I have talked about this before. And I think a lot of what's happened in American medical culture is we have become so corporatized that when you talk to individuals, like if you talk to practicing docs and ask a question, if you could answer this question by participating in a clinical trial, would you like to do it? In my experience, almost 100% say yes. Then you say, okay, let's do it. And they say, but I would love to do it, but it's going to take 15 minutes or 30 minutes a day, and no one will pay me for that time. It'll slow down our clinic, it'll slow down our cath lab, whatever it is. And I just, can't practically do it. And then you go to the leaders, I guess I'm one of those now, and you say, why don't you make this, part of your ingrained culture? And well, the answer is we've got to implement our electronic health record, and we're worried about our payment system and all these other things that get in the way first. So I've gone through all the phases of death on this, and I really think the answer is going to be patient advocates. I think the customer of the system is going to have to speak up, and it's been impossible to do that because there wasn't a vehicle, but now because of all the same information technology, if you've got, I saw it with my sister-in-law when she got breast cancer. She was on the internet immediately after getting home from the oncologist, and there were a whole network of people giving advice. And as that community, breast cancer in particular, has gotten wiser, they're now promoting clinical trials as the best way to get your clinical care. So I think we ought to be, those of us concerned about this probably are wasting our time by convincing our deans and CEOs. But I think working with patient advocates to do it. I mean, what's amazing, I guess this comes with getting older, but I used to think that the old people in charge of things could just, change them. But what you find is the deans and CEOs feel just as victimized by this as the people at the lower levels, and they don't know what to do about it. So I think the pressure from the patients to think this way is what eventually will change it. One other little insight, in my last trip to India, in addition to almost getting deported, which is a different story, I met with patient advocacy groups in India, and it is remarkable to see the difference culturally between the United States and India in that regard. And if you see where they are now, and then you see where we are, you can see that there actually is progress that can be made. So I'm not totally pessimistic about it. Either one.
Rob, thank you so much for your insightful talk. I'm from the Food and Drug Administration, and I work in the Devices Center. The question I have is, you showed the graph about the level of regulation and the ability to innovate. I would like to add something to that graph, is that level of regulation is not constant, that it does move up and down in response to either political or risk perception, and risk perception is often driven by events, and some of those events may be due to the freedom to innovate, and so it all ties into each other. They all integrate, and sometimes early on in a field, as it develops, there is less regulation in that area. But as things happen, for example, in the gene therapy area, and in a variety of things, I've been at FDA for a number of years, and I've seen different things happen as a product area matures, or things happen during the development of a product area, then if it gets noticed, if there's undue risk, and the regulation of that area may go up. And sometimes products go on the market and there are problems, and the public perception and the public discourse says, hey, let's do something about that risk, and the regulation goes up. And so it ties in, and the pushback in the other front is innovation, and the need to have innovative products out there, and developing new areas. So early on, maybe less regulation. Would you like to comment? I'm sorry.
I think your points are very well taken. And I think within the FDA, as you all know, there are obviously many people struggling to deal with the shifts that need to be made to respond to the circumstances. And I guess my argument, as hard as it may be, is that because what you say I think is true, that is, one standard should not fit all. The name of the game, I think, at the FDA is to get ahead of the curve in terms of policies that promote innovation where it's needed, and sort of anticipate where it's needed, but also help the public understand when a risk, help the public scale a risk appropriately, because I think one thing you alluded to, which I really believe to be true, is that a single event can change everything when there's no rational, I mean, there's a lot written about this, no rational reason why it should, other than it happens to get publicized. And so I think if we're going to succeed, we've got to be able to have differential levels based on policies that are well-reasoned. Or you could just say we need great leaders. That's maybe another way to say it.
Rob, my question goes back to the prior question and answer. The problem with relying on patient advocacy groups as the hope for the future is that comparative effectiveness research has been spun by who knows whom for political reasons to equal rationalization. It's become a dirty word. I went to a thing for an AFib group, which included AFib advocacy organizations, and gave, what I thought was going to be the canned talk on CER, only to find that there's a lot of pushback amongst patients who don't understand CER as anything other than, you're going to tell me what drugs or devices I can or can't have. And I don't know, probably certainly the Institute's in a better position than individual academic organizations, but somehow if patient advocates are going to help push the research enterprise, there's going to have to be education that CER is not a bad thing. And in fact is how we made the advances that we have.
I completely agree, and I understand what's happened with the politics. It's actually quite remarkable because it seems so obvious that if you had atrial fib right now, you would really like to know, is warfarin better, is rivaroxaban better, is dabigatran better? These are major choices, and having a stroke that could have been prevented because you didn't know which was better would seem like kind of a silly thing to let happen. But the opponents have obviously positioned this that if something loses in a comparative effectiveness trial, it's winner take all. When in fact a well-designed trial with the right sample size, which of course would be 100 times larger than most trials that are done, if there were profiles of people who got better outcomes with one treatment versus the other, you would pick that up, and then we'd all be better off. But it's been interesting to watch my friends on PCORI as they try, knowing what they know and actually believe, trying to hold to the party line about we don't look at economics in this. It's just kind of silly, but that's where we are. So I think the answer to that, Alice, is engaging with the patient advocacy groups. And one of the things I've learned in the Durham County thing, which I guess for people who are extroverted is, that anyway, is sometimes you have to sit through a little bit of you saying, why the hell am I here? God, another chicken dinner. But the payoff is quite remarkable. And once you get the engagement, the things that can be done but that you just couldn't have done otherwise are great. Nancy?
Hi, Rob. Thanks for a very interesting and thoughtful talk. I was thinking a little bit about how to simplify clinical trials, what you were mentioning in the beginning of your talk. And one of the things you didn't mention was limiting the eligibility criteria so that you have a disease, I think you'll benefit from this trial, therefore I can randomize you. It's been done very little in our history, but it is done sometimes. I wonder why that hasn't caught on. It's a really a way to basically open up a trial to the population for whom it is of interest.
So you're talking about Peto's uncertainty principle. And that was the basis for the acute MI trials that we all did together. But again, we had this marker, the electrocardiogram. By the way, two cardiologists looking at the electrocardiogram only agree 95% of the time when there's ST elevation. So it's not perfect. But you had this one marker that was a real signifier of a problem, and then it really was at that point very easy to randomize and to do comparative effectiveness with mortality as the outcome. So I think it is overcoming the cultural thing. I think the countercurrent now that we have to think through carefully is if you believe that there are strong, let's say, genetic influences on the response to a treatment, then the argument is you do better by focusing your enrollment instead of broadening it. You're making a face, and you know exactly what I think about it, which is that more than half the time the thought is wrong about a genetically based study. And I got some ammunition today. I read in the paper that there was another study sequencing different parts of tumors, and the genetic defect is different depending on the part of the tumor you take out, apparently. I haven't read the paper, so I could have misinterpreted. But yeah, so, I mean, to me, the simplest thing to do would be to use the uncertainty principle, using a system of electronic health records, randomize a lot of people. You'd have some random noise. The random noise would filter out, but you'd have a much stronger signal because you'd have adequate events to be able to say something.
I'm Paul Coates. I'm acting director of the Office of Disease Prevention. And just to close this out, I wanted to thank the folks who co-sponsored this with us, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, the National Institute on Aging, and the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. These are joint efforts that encourage a conversation at the NIH about areas where there is controversy. I have a feeling that Dr. Califf did exactly what we wanted in inviting him to come to this. It resonated with lots of you. I know you probably have many other questions, but he's on his way to Atlanta for an important event, and I want to wish him well, and on behalf of everybody, I'd like to thank you again.
Thanks.